So if you could take your seat so we can restart. So really this is, the topic of the moment, blockchain technology. At a session that I'll be participating in tomorrow on how to detect fraud, I'll actually be discussing a couple of blockchain frauds that haven't really yet properly been exposed in Bermuda. Bermuda has decided to go into the crypto fraud business. This next session is entitled Crypto Crime, How to Prevent and Detect Crypto Fraud and Recover Coin if you've already been swindled or you represent somebody who's already been swindled. It's going to be presented by US-based attorneys Dan Eckhart and David Haas, both of Global Asset Allies, and Pawel Aleksander of Coinfirm in the UK.
Thank you, David. We'll give you a little bit, just a 1-minute intro about each of us. Again, my name is David Haas. I'm a former federal prosecutor from the United States. Arguably, I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but I was one of the pioneers leading some of the first cryptocurrency prosecutions when Bitcoin was about $110 a coin. There was no policy of how to open an e-wallet so that we could go on Silk Road and purchase drugs. So we just made it and went with it. Ever since then, as crypto has sort of evolved, I've stayed plugged in. I'll introduce Dan Eckhart, let him tell you a little bit about himself. Or you want me to do it? All right.
No,
we're informal.
I don't trust him. I'm going to talk about myself first. Dave and I have known each other for a number of years. I was also a federal prosecutor in Orlando, worked with him for about a decade. Go back in a time machine. I was a special agent with U.S. Customs back in the 80s, and I've kept the same hairstyle from 1988. But done a number of things over my career, but like David said, the cryptocurrency, fraud, money laundering, it's all in our wheelhouse. Now we're both out in the private sector, and it's a pleasure to be here. This is a great organization, and I think you're going to find what we're going to say is helpful. And on our panel is Pawel, and he'll talk about himself a little bit.
Good afternoon. Good morning, actually, still. My name is Pawel Aleksander, and I'm a co-founder of Coinfirm, the company which focuses on anti-money laundering and fraud investigations for blockchain applications. And I'm going to talk a bit more about how you can practically approach to the fraud investigations and anti-money laundering for this type of crypto swindles, and what are the exact solution and what are the exact shape of the crypto environment where it is heading, and what should be done actually to achieve the good level of protection.
I'll go ahead and take the first slide, and just fair warning, we've collaborated on this, and it's fair game. If you got questions, we're probably going to have them at the end. We're going to reserve probably at least 10 to 15 minutes, and I think that's probably going to be the most helpful part of the presentation. But in the meantime, we're going to bounce things off of each other. As you can see from this slide, November 11th, 2018, according to CoinMarket, there were 2,097 cryptocurrencies out there. And for those of you who aren't, and we're assuming that everybody knows what a cryptocurrency is, if you don't, I relied on something from the BBC this morning since we are in London. And this is what the BBC said. Cryptocurrency is basically a computer file which is stored in a digital wallet on a computer. People can send cryptocurrency or part of one to a digital wallet, and you can send cryptocurrency to other people. Every single transaction is recorded in a public list called the blockchain. Now, that's going to be the shortest explanation of cryptocurrencies that you're going to get at any presentation, but we want to do that because we want to move on to the fraud aspect of it. And of course, Pawel, at the end, he's going to talk about some of the more technical issues. I want to get the next slide. Now, here are the companies, at least some of the companies in the United States that are using cryptocurrency, accepting it as payment, and there's several others, and every day it's changing, and you're going to see that. One of the things that's somewhat of a hypocrisy is, I don't know how many of you go to some of these banking conferences or network with banks, but publicly, I mean, they're banks, right? So this could be possibly a threat to their industry. But on a side note, open source, you can see that most of these big banks are investing millions and millions of dollars in this technology. And so it's kind of an unusual situation. This is Bill Gates.
He's a good friend of ours.
No. Yeah, well, maybe David's, not mine. But anyhow, this is what Bill Gates commented on cryptocurrency back in February. And long story short, he's got some issues with it. He's skeptical, and what he's saying is, not necessarily incorrect or inaccurate. And in the United States, and I'm not sure how it's working here, but we've got this crisis with fentanyl, several deaths throughout the country, and there's a really strong initiative from the Department of Justice, the DEA, to try to prosecute the distributors of fentanyl, heroin, because of the deaths.
I went to the next one. Yeah. I went to the next slide.
Okay. Next slide is just a recent report of that. And, of course, here's where we fit in with the cryptocurrency. They're using it to finance, to buy the heroin, to launder the money, all the things that the investigators in this room are familiar with. It's just a different package. It's a different vehicle, which obviously is more complex, harder to track, involves a lot more intel from a human level and also from the technology level to track it. Turn over to David.
So getting into some of the meat, any sort of financial crime, there's similar veins. And so while there are some frauds that are unique to the crypto world, a lot of these are going to be sort of regurgitated financial crimes, just taking the form of a crypto payout. So hacks, ransomware, malicious mining, and we're going to go into some of these. Where you see, I think, some of the more broad scope fraud at this point is with ICOs, Ponzi and investments. And then, as Don Ford mentioned, ATMs. At least in the United States, you had gas stations where you could go get your tax returns prepared, which were just identity theft and tax schemes. Those basically same gas stations are now putting ATM machines for crypto, in their front yard, because crypto still, I believe, from the last numbers I saw, Bitcoin is still 97% illegal conduct, and mostly narcotics purchases taking place on dark websites. There's too many of those to list, but you see it in human trafficking, digital online payouts. Dan's going to talk in a little bit about the material support of terrorism, circumventing, obviously, tax laws, international sanctions, and extortion. You see some extortion schemes. I'll tell you a story. I was talking to a friend the other day at a soccer game, football game here, I guess, so to speak. He was talking about how his mother was basically a victim of a blackmail extortion scheme on the phone. She had to go online, figure out while she was on the phone about crypto. The notable part of this story is her son, who I was speaking with, was an FBI agent for the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So it happens to everyone, even people that are connected to the law enforcement realms. Most numbers you see, I think this was you.
Yep. So basically, as David said, crypto space has some unique types of crime which are not that common in a traditional sector, and these are mainly ICOs related as well as ransomware. But otherwise, we can expect here actually the same variety of crime types which actually affect the traditional financial system. So in this space, in a crypto space, we have, in fact, the really big issues with hacks. This is number one in terms of the value. The second is scam, and this is something that actually is the most frequent one. And the average blockchain society member can lose money very easily because there is really a lot of approaches to that. So there are phishing schemes. There are people who are actually very much engaged in a hacking space, and those people who actually are using Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies are much more vulnerable for the fraud than those who are the regular users of the internet, just by entering some websites. So, for example, last year we had a very big issue with scam of My Ether wallet. This is one of the main applications which allows you to transact with the Ether. And there was a fake website with fake DNS, and this website is actually swindled a lot of private keys, and in the result, actually, the funds were moved to the hacker address, and as I know for today, they are still remaining that and waiting for being laundered, basically.
And by hacks, what you just to sort of get a little bit more granular, you're talking about hacking of either e-wallets, the digital wallets that hold the coins. You can also hack the platforms where there's trading them. So you can see all various different levels of hacks. I think Mt. Gox was probably one of the more notorious, whether it was a hack or not.
Yeah, basically, usually when there was a hack or any other type of crime or swindle, this type of activities is in more than 90% followed by some layering scheme. The layering scheme which occurs on a blockchain networks, and it's mainly passing the funds through the chain of thousands of transactions, aiming to lose the taint. And eventually, more than 90% of these layered funds has some known endpoints, and these known endpoints are mostly cryptocurrency exchanges, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, how actually exchanges are protecting themselves against receiving this type of fraudulent money, and how actually we can help them, how this ecosystem should be protected in practice.
I just got one comment as far as the hacks of the cryptocurrency. There's a famous American, Willie Sutton. I don't know if anybody knows Willie Sutton, bank robber, and he was asked, why do you rob banks? And he said, well, that's where the money is. Same concept. There's a lot of money here, so that's why the hacks are taking place.
So I mentioned ICOs, or what are initial coin offerings. This is sort of the modern day version of an IPO, an initial public offering, where a coin, somebody comes up with a concept, they want to raise the funds and sort of, create a mainstream investment for their coin. Where you see a lot of fraud here is and when we were at the last offshore conference, there's attorneys in Cayman that their whole focus is to get the coin out into the public. There's absolutely very little, and I'm being complimentary there, BSA, anti-money laundering concepts behind the initial coin offerings. And so basically what they're doing is they're putting coins into circulation. We're up to probably 3,000 by today, where there's a know your customer, minimal know your customers, which is really the whole purpose behind what was Bitcoin. Even though the blockchain, as everybody probably now knows, they are traceable transactions through the blockchain. You now see different derivatives of blockchain where it makes it more difficult to trace, and some, but at least on the Bitcoin blockchain, which is where most things come through. But now you get into, through these initial coin offerings, then you get into soft forks and hard forks, where there's a coin that is offered, and then they're going to change the coin a little bit and keep it on the same blockchain. That's a soft fork. And then you get into a hard fork, which is really there's a coin, and then all of a sudden that coin's no longer good, and they've created a whole new coin and a whole new blockchain. So what happens to those investments and what was the initial coin? They're gone. And so determining fraud of what was originally invested in and what the coin became are fairly clear. The study I found said that about 80% of ICOs are fraudulent. I think that's probably
that's
conservative.
Pretty much conservative, I would say. And
this is not a Bitcoin.
Yeah, we made this morning. It's our ICO. So if anybody wants to invest in us, we're here. That's all easy.
And In fact, actually, most of these initial coin offerings does not conduct the proper KYC when issuing tokens, and it's regardless whether they issue the utility tokens or security or stable coins or whatever else. We actually have right now a lot of clients which approach to us because they have collected a substantial amount of money in Ether, but because they didn't actually conducted the proper AML KYC, they right now cannot cash out. And that there is really a big problem for them to find a bank which would like to actually take such money. And we are trying to support them actually making the ex-post AML service, but this is still difficult. And this just shows that this market, actually even 1 year ago when there was an ICO boom, it was not yet mature to actually overcome all these obstacles. But right now we can see that actually this part of the blockchain market, means ICO, is civilizing, and I can observe that right now investors, contributors are not that much stupider like 1 year ago, and indeed they do some more proper investigations of who stays behind the project and what are the fundamentals, as well as the projects themselves. They start to have the coverage in terms of anti-money laundering. Many of these projects are actually cooperating with regulators and trying to look for whether their tokens actually can be treated as utility tokens, or whether these are the securities and they need the permissions for issuance. So this market is changing. I can observe here that the possible next trend after the ICOs is going to be stable coins, which are also the kind of tokens, but in this case backed up by some real assets. So we have examples of, for example, USD coin, the coin which is issued by one of the major US exchanges, and it's going to be backed up by the US dollar, and so some other ones as well with different assets. And the market trends actually indicates that this may become another, I don't want to say bubble, but another trend which may require regulatory focus for sure.
And so where you see this sort of modernization of the regulations catching up to ICOs, at least in the United States, it's sort of similar to kind of penny stock fraud, where you see a lot of marketing pushes, and then we'll talk about pump and dumps for the coins. So there's a worthless coin somebody owns a lot of, there's a marketing push behind it, and then all of a sudden the owners of the coin will sell it, and it just turns into sort of a modern day pump and dump type of scheme. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so basically, in terms of what's the reason behind the ICOs being so frequently swindled, is also that the people does not check very much who is standing behind such project. Very often the contributions were made just because someone has put the website with the interesting content with some copied roadmap. There was even no terms inside, and I would say that mostly this is the case of the newbies in a crypto space, which are the young investors which actually try to earn a significant value in a very short time just by holding tokens which are actually worthless from the point of view of experienced investor. So in this sense, actually, while there's still a lack of regulations in most of the jurisdictions, this is something that is problematic. But as I said, the market is getting mature in this space. We probably need to give this just some more time.
So from basically this year, more than half of ICOs failed to raise capital, disappeared, or refunded their participants. 10 ICOs raised 47% of all capital. Remember, the two sort of standard bearers in the crypto market are Ethereum and Bitcoin. Everybody sort of, with these ICOs, is looking for the third or the next best thing. There's 40% of investments going to infrastructure projects, and again, 97% of Bitcoin flows into unregulated exchanges, which for the most part, I think you're going to find illegal narcotics, dark websites, which is where most Bitcoin. When I did some of the sellers that were on Silk Road, we prosecuted them, there was a big debate afterwards in all of the Bitcoin that was seized from the owner of Silk Road, Ross Ulbricht, about what to do with it. And there was a debate whether or not the government should actually resell those coins back into society, or whether they should delete it. Now, sort of, I think, and I can say this because I'm not with the government anymore, the government's dealing with the after effect of reissuing those coins, is because it's just gone to basically continue to feed that beast of the illegal drug trade that's online.
Okay, I'm going to take this slide. Is Paul Vernon here today? Paul, if you're here, raise your hand. There's a guy named Don Ford from the IRS who'd like to talk to you. As you can see, this news report talks about a civil class action. Well, beyond that, there's been public disclosures, reports from the Freedom of Information Act and Privacy Act that CRIPSI's under investigation by the IRS, the SEC, FinCEN, ongoing investigation, obviously, so nobody's going to comment about it, for a number of things, market manipulations, failure to know their customers, and failure to register with FinCEN, which is Treasury, U.S. Treasury, FinCEN. One of the things that is an issue for all these American-based cryptocurrency outfits is that there's a requirement that they register with the state and the feds as a money service business. And those laws vary from state to state, so that's a real landmine, or it's a real problem for a lot of them. One of the other things that is a good takeaway from this is these class action lawsuits. As you know, the United States is ridiculously litigious. You can swing a dead cat and find a personal injury attorney. Okay, we don't do that, so we're not that type of lawyer. But what's happened is you're seeing these class action lawsuits. You have victims of some type of cryptocurrency scam, particularly where there's a computer hack. These hacks are pretty prevalent, and there's not the disclosure to the owners of the cryptocurrency that there was a hack. There's also market manipulation from insiders, and sometimes it's calculated or orchestrated, other times it's not. So what you have is folks within the financial industry that maybe they could be with one of the bigger financial institutions that's investing in some sort of cryptocurrency, or doing market research on it. They gain inside information, and they've got some guy that's an employee that works at the bank that decides he's going to capitalize on it. And so it's a big issue for employers, is to try to monitor what their employees are doing as far as cryptocurrency is concerned.
And I want to echo on something Dan mentioned, which is the registration requirements. There are civil, but there are also criminal penalties for those violations of being unlicensed money service businesses. And so what you see in the industry is this competition. Remember, blockchain, most crypto users at the time, at least in the initial phases, they wanted to be anonymous because they're doing illegal transactions. And then now the regulations are catching up, where it's you got to know your customer, and you're seeing this tug of war back and forth about coins that are really trying to be issued that go through the proper AML and BSA, and then you have those others that are not and never really intending to be. So that's where you see this tug of war, and where the regulations are finally catching up. I mean, again, when we did our first prosecutions, there were no rules on any of this. We were trying to piece cryptocurrency prosecutions into the money service businesses. Now FinCEN has finally caught up and issuing them and coming along. But again, and it sounds like that was a long time ago, but you're really talking in the last 5 years. So,
yeah, and just as another note to that, it's important what Dave said. I mean, we both got mostly criminal backgrounds as criminal, federal prosecutors, and sometimes we're just baffled or amazed by folks that run to a civil firm and they're told, hey, this is a civil issue. Well, there is something called criminal liability. It's under 18 U.S.C. 1960, and it's a 5-year felony. And the unique thing about it is it's basically a money laundering statute. So they can come in and seize and forfeit all involved in property, not just those transactions, and they can get substitute assets. So they can take, the bad guy's, residence, they can take his boat, his yacht, whatever. So.
And if you were to Google some of the prosecutions coming out of the United States, you're seeing a lot of 1960 prosecutions, which was a statute that wasn't frequently used. I talked a little bit about pump and dump schemes. Again, I've had former clients or former defendants of schemes that were pump and dump of penny stocks that are now basically doing the same thing with crypto, because they think in their own mind it's less regulated. In a lot of ways it is, but they think because it's less regulated, it's still perfectly legal, which is still the opposite. It's not. So here's an article about Tether.
Yeah, this is another case study. Anybody, you can Google all this information. It's open source. This is an example of a stable coin, as Pawel spoke of, where there's, in theory, supposed to be U.S. assets or foreign assets someplace in a safe, whether it's gold or it's money. And one of the first cases in the United States was called eGold. And eGold actually, well, it was the first. I think it was the first. And interestingly enough, it was actually my case. But the problem that we had, and it goes into what Don Ford said earlier, is just limited resources. So you've got this monster case. You're in Orlando, Florida. You're a jack of all trades, a master of none. So it ended up going to D.C. and actually was successfully prosecuted out of D.C. with Secret Service, but it took a long time. And so that's a theme that you're going to hear, is limited resources, very good at what they do. It's just a matter of marrying up, people such as yourself and getting that information to them. But as you can see, Tether, all sorts of problems, allegations of market manipulation. Bitcoin jumped way up in December of 2017. Interesting side note, the former director of the FBI, Louis Freeh, we have a former supervisor that actually works for his group. Louis Freeh's investigative arm or his law firm went in and did apparently I don't want to say it's an audit, but they went ahead and they've vouched that there is this, I don't want to say pot of gold, but there's this money that supports this type of coin. It's apparently $2.5 billion, but they won't disclose what banks that the money's located in, which I don't know how that works, but I don't know if Pawel has anything to say on that or not.
And again, similar, you see Ponzi schemes with crypto as well. Again, it's sort of, if any golfers here, it's the 19th hole tip. Well, I've got an investment, it's the next hot coin. Everybody puts in their money, and there's some paybacks. So really, that's a traditional model just being modernized with a different product. Crypto blackmail, I think, is a little bit more prevalent. I actually have a crypto client who receives an email. Sometimes there's basically a lewd allegation that there's some pornography that they've been able to access on their personal device, or them using their personal device in making this. And the extortion part or the blackmail part becomes in that they want to pay out in crypto, Bitcoin, or they're going to release those pictures and all those things onto the internet, and they'll be very embarrassing. That's obviously a very modern sort of function of crypto, because you're not sending US dollars or pounds or euros. And so that transaction disappears into the abyss. And those emails tend to have very detailed, probably through Facebook leaks or breaches, passwords that get revealed, and there's some allegation that touches a thread that somebody's willing to learn crypto very quickly and part with money.
Usually these threats are fake, so in most cases actually hackers do not possess the actual data of you, but you cannot be sure about this, and in many cases actually people decide to pay some sort of ransom for being, let's say, protected. And in this case as well, this is the standard scheme where which actually is later followed by the laundering, the track of funds, which eventually ends up on some known exchanges usually.
We talked a little bit about exchanges and wallets and hacks. I guess the number here is crypto is traded, obviously one of the larger ones being Coinbase, and there's hacks to the actual exchanges that resulted in about 1.3 billion since 2010, just based upon vulnerabilities. Again, with the development of coins, you're talking about very sophisticated potential hackers or otherwise who are simply trying to mine and get into it. I'm sure that...
Yeah, so basically also in terms of mining means actually creation the new coins, which is associated with confirmation of transactions in blockchain network. So basically the miners are those subjects which actually are responsible for maintaining the network and confirming transactions, in results receiving the fees for their work, for their input of the computing power in the network. But this is also frequently associated with the money laundering schemes, because newly mined coins are much more difficult to track, because there is technologically no flow of funds in the blockchain network. And we can observe, for example, the schemes where actually people are trying to set extraordinary high fees for blockchain transactions, and these fees goes to miners, and in result, because the fees are not the transfer of fees to miners is not recorded in a blockchain network, most of the blockchain networks. It's much more difficult to track some funds. In our case, in our solutions, we actually mark this type of activities as a red flag, but in fact, the traceability is much lower in these cases.
Any gamers in the audience? Video gamers? Call of Duty, very popular. Cryptocurrency theft and hacks occurred from the stealing of more than 3 million. Again, some of this we just ripped from the headlines, but there's all kinds of ways to access e-wallets and to get backdoor access. Basically meeting members of the Ring Online playing Call of Duty, and they would sort of wheel their way into stealing through their e-wallets.
Yeah, and it's it's nice we put it in there because it's a recent example. I think it's within the last month. U.S. Attorney's Office in Northern District of Illinois, but it's success, right? I mean, they've got a prosecution, don't know all the ins and outs of it, but they just probably flipped somebody. It's a system of snitches in the United States, and so they got somebody to flip, provide the information, and they've got the they got the conviction.
Some of the sort of the latest trends as far as regulation, September, so we're literally a month or 2 months out from that. A number of firsts, including the prosecution by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, FINRA, and the U.S. Attorney's Office of basically ICOs and crypto prosecutions. The SEC's first action was for an online cryptocurrency platform operating, again, as an unregistered broker-dealer, which is that 1960 violation. That's really the two organizations that needed to basically get up to speed the fastest, and FINRA getting into the world, and the regulation and the enforcement actions is a big deal in the United States. You also had a federal district court deny a motion to dismiss an indictment relating to cryptocurrency conduct. Again, the courts, at least in the United States, were still dealing with whether crypto was an asset, whether it had value, whether it was a property, whether it was a security. So you're really at sort of the birthing of whether or not these coins or these algorithms had any sort of value at all. And after some bouncing around early on, back when Dan and I were first doing these cases, it's now sort of become more and more well settled that these are of value and finding a place as a property.
I'll just add to that. We had a birthing, but there's several different names for this child. The SEC calls it a security. The IRS calls it. The IRS calls it a property. SEC calls it a security. FinCEN's calling it money, and the FTC is calling it commodities. And those all vary with the different scenarios you have. So there's a lot of different regulators with a lot of different takes.
Here's your terrorism slide.
Next slide, speaks for itself. Talks about or represents the issue with the terrorism or the possible threat of terrorism with cryptocurrency. Let's go to the next one. Now, the interesting thing is there has been a lot of hype over the years, but there are a few documented cases of significant funding. There's some case studies where there's been some relatively minor funding. I think the next one's a good example of that. There are some lone wolf examples out there where we have some kid in his basement in Peoria, Illinois that's he's been converted to some sort of radical Islam and he's trying to raise money, using Bitcoin or some type of cryptocurrency. Fun fact, if any of you want to go on the dark web this afternoon and check this out and you think you're talking to somebody that is a terrorist, it's probably an FBI agent. Okay, that's just, if you take away one thing from this presentation, take away that. And the majority of listings on the dark web are usually for U.S. firearms. I don't know what that says about our culture in light of some of the recent tragedies we've had, but that's according to the RAND study recently.
Yep, and this is actually true, and there is an easy way actually how you can recognize whether these addresses are belonging actually to actual criminals or the law enforcement, because in most cases the law enforcement makes this not, let's say, entirely properly, because once someone is making payment to such blockchain address appearing on a darknet website, they usually wait for some time with moving the funds from that address, but eventually these funds does not pass through any funds laundering scheme, and this is very easily recognizable that these are not criminals.
And back when I did my first cases, we probably established the first undercover Bitcoin e-wallet that was used by the government to further drug transactions and purchase controlled substances on the dark web. Now, obviously, as much as compliance and AML is required, you're going to get the criminals on the other side of the equation doing their due diligence to make sure that they're not actually buying from the FBI either. So, again, that tug of war goes back and forth, where back then nobody was really checking to see and nobody would believe that it was the government funding it. Now that's flipped. So, or terrorism, here's the
example, and I got my states wrong. Public schools, Virginia, not Illinois, a 17-year-old teen convicted or pled guilty to providing material support to ISIL. I think this is back in 2015. Go to the next slide.
That was crypto.
And here's some recent testimony, United States House Subcommittee on Terrorism and Illicit Finance. The gentleman is Yahya Fanusi, and he is with the Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance, expert on terrorism and cryptocurrency. And his takeaways were that we have to prepare. Obviously, everybody in this room is on the same page, so to speak, with preparing for the threat of cryptocurrency and terrorist financing. But if you drill down, the current state of cryptocurrency is that cash is still king. Think about it. You're in some remote part of the world. You've got a bunch of cryptocurrency in an electronic wallet someplace, and you need to buy, machine guns or grenades or food. Yeah, it just doesn't work that way necessarily. So cash is still king. One of the things that he suggests that I think is actually happening now, I know it's happening now, is collaboration between private entities, establishing a database that addresses who the bad guys are, who the suspected illicit actors are on the blockchain. I don't know if Pawel has anything on that at all, or
Well, we're going to cover this.
The next couple slides.
You've also now got nations sponsoring their own cryptocurrencies. Very friendly places to the United States, like Iran, Russia, Venezuela, are all sort of pushing this. It's susceptible to manipulation and control. It's, whether oligarchs are trying to seize more from this. Again, we talked about the terrorist financing. You can find, the drug trafficking, especially in some of the third world countries where there is no ability. There's really viable markets for those countries to be able to pass coins back and forth from phones if they have that ability even there as well. So, again, several nations, as Dan mentioned, banks are really the legitimate sort of blockchain technology that's grown out of this is probably the most fruitful. And then you get into the global regulators, which takes us more to power.
Yeah, and basically, also this is an important trend that actually banks and traditional financial institutions are starting to adopt this technology. We know already some banks which are actually issuing their own coins, which are backed up, for example, to the national currencies. We know that there are the banks which actually accept deposits of companies using crypto. Basically, mostly this is preceded by some kind of in-depth source of wealth analytics. But in all these cases, there is a huge need for the regulations. And especially last year, we have observed some increased trends in regulatory aspects, and such countries, for example, as Gibraltar, Japan, or Malta, they accept from requiring the anti-money laundering inclusions for the entities. They require them to be registered. And this is a very positive trend, and to my opinion, this is going to expand to the other countries. In the European Union, we've got fourth and fifth anti-money laundering directive, which last year actually included exchanges and wallets into the scope of the obliged institutions. And there is a very nice, actually, definitions in this directive that actually it can be translated, in other words, that an obliged institutions in crypto space is the entity which holds your private keys on your behalf. So in this case, the deposit addresses of the exchanges or online wallets are actually the addresses to which the private keys are held by these exchanges or wallets. And by this, actually, they became the obliged institutions which have to implement both KYC and AML, transaction monitoring, which is right now a big challenge for the crypto space. How to implement the transaction monitoring, and I'm going to show you in a minute also how you can practically do this. Yeah. So also exactly. So FATF, usually this is the first source of any type of guidelines for the crypto space. And we see that they actually recently they updated their standard report with the definitions of what is actually the virtual assets and how it should be handled in terms of the regulations. They actually are pointing since 2014 that the effective regulations around crypto space need some cross-jurisdictional cooperation. And this requires both exchange of information between the law enforcement as well as some smart approach of how it can be done. So basically, we said a lot about how problematic is the blockchain space. But in fact, I always like to stress out that in a traditional financial sector, only like 2% of the laundered money is catched by the banking systems. And in fact, even from the point of view of a single project as a Coinfirm is, there can be catch much more. Actually, when I first time read the white paper of Satoshi Nakamoto, it was in 2011, I realized that blockchain can be actually the most transparent system ever created, just if equipped with the proper AML compliance tools and regulatory framework. So basically, yeah, you can switch this. Yeah. So I will maybe talk a bit more about how the particular solutions and environment for this technology should look like, actually, to give the sufficient protection. So in terms of anti-money laundering and verification of transactions, blockchain has certain benefits to compare with traditional financial system, which is openness. You can see all transactions in a public ledger. You have the access to all transactions. And the data standardization, which is uncommon for the traditional financial sector, the data integrity, which is actually right now the obstacle for many bankers to actually conduct the proper KYC, for example. And for the blockchain, the solutions that would be effective must meet some standards. So such solution need to be blockchain agnostic, so it needs to cover not only Bitcoin but other cryptocurrencies as well. It needs to actually use all these modern technologies like graph databases or machine learning. We, for example, observe that we cannot have the good standard monitoring solution without using the graph databases, because the graph databases is the only mean right now which actually allows you to detect if the wallet you are evaluating is somehow connected to some other flagged wallets, for example, related to terrorist financing. You cannot achieve these results with the traditional databases like MySQL because of the computing power issues. This algorithms actually also need to encompass such scenarios like, for example, clustering. These are the types of scenarios which are aimed to identify wallets belonging to the same person or entity based on one known wallet. This is actually true that having one address, one wallet of particular cryptocurrency exchange, we can find the remaining 5 million just based on a data analytics. It also requires some specific scenarios which are characteristic for blockchain. So in the model we've developed, for example, we evaluate the wallets of people or entities using both scenarios which are let's say similar to the traditional banking solutions. So, for example, we check if these wallets receive structured deposits. We check if the wallet is accumulating funds for the long period. But also these scenarios needs several solutions which are characteristic for blockchain sector only. So, for example, if someone is using frequently multiple input transactions when the funds are going from many accounts to many accounts in one transaction, this is usually typical for the people who try to layer the track of funds. They use this type of transactions more frequently. And we need to increase the risk rating of such wallets. So in terms of exactly transaction monitoring, the technology is the key feature, but it's also the enable in this case. Also, in terms of sanctions, so far, except from the KYC, there has not been developed yet the effective solution how to actually find the source, the geographical source of blockchain transactions. we are right now piloting the solution, which actually allows you to detect this based on information from the nodes, our own nodes distributed around the globe. So this is based on some scenarios related to triangulation and IP detection, and by this you can actually estimate the location of the origin of transaction. I don't know, David,
I don't know what slide you're on. Here, you want to get one of it?
Yeah, sure. So basically, as mentioned already, the main endpoints for the fraudulent transactions in a blockchain space are actually crypto exchanges, and we can see that this space is not yet mature. We have the entities like, for example, Shapeshift, which exchange a lot of transactions without any KYC, and this includes, for example, anonymous coins like Zcash or Monero. But on the other hand, we see that, especially during the last year, the major exchanges such as, for example, Binance or Poloniex, which handle billions, equivalent of billions of dollars of transactions, are improving their KYC standard. So, for example, Binance, they do have right now the KYC process in place. However, we can see that you can deposit and withdraw amounts up to 2 bitcoins without any KYC coverage. Poloniex, for example, this is one of the major US exchanges which allows exchange of crypto to crypto only without fiat deposits and withdrawals. This exchange for a long time was actually acting without any KYC, and right now in 2018 they implemented actually quite good coverage encompassing both KYC and transaction monitoring. And we have decided actually to go more in deep into the topic of how the exchanges are these key endpoints of the system are protecting themselves, and we have examined the AML processes of them, and this includes, for example, whether they have the process at all, whether they have AML policies in place, whether they identify publicly exposed persons during that process, whether they allows for withdrawals without certain documents in place in the KYC process, and so on and so on. And on the slides here, I've got some initial results from the report we are preparing. This was based on the sample of more than 30 exchanges. In the full report, it's going to be several hundred of exchanges, most of the market actually. And yeah, let's just see what are these results. So, for example, we can see that 26% of exchanges were confirmed as being licensed by regulators. So this is a good trend because for the last year it was less than 10%, but on the other hand we see that by volume this is actually the more intriguing because most of the exchanges counting by volume were not licensed by the regulators. We can we were able to see that 40% of exchanges were confirmed as having AML policies in place. And in this case, actually this was the majority of them also in terms of the volume of transactions. Also, 36% of exchanges did not have any transparent and complex KYC process in place. And this is actually still the biggest issue that in the jurisdictions, especially in Asia or in the countries which are considered medium or high risk countries, there is a lot of exchanges registered with big volumes which actually still do not have the KYC process in place. 33% of exchanges do not appear to comply with UN sanctions screening. And in terms of volume, it's actually, again, most of this examined, maybe not most, okay, but the significant part by volume, 56 billion of volume, was belonging to the exchanges which does not cover sanction screening. Another one is that 57% of exchanges do not appear to have in place any procedures to identify publicly exposed persons. So also in terms of volume. So basically in their KYC questionnaires, they do not care about whether someone who is opening the account on their services is a PEP or not. I'm going to show you also for the end some movie which may be interested, especially for the investigators. I don't know if it's gonna work. Yeah, let's
There you go.
Yeah. So this is the case of the BTC e-hack, which is which was one of the largest exchanges from which around $500 million were stolen. And I'm showing here actually how easy it is to track the money on blockchain networks. This is our tool where you can just put in the hacked address and ask the database with one query where these funds has went, and it automatically dips the destination for the funds. So you can see here the chain of transactions. It's appearing as a main chain from which there are some bubbles. These are all blockchain addresses which are destination of funds of this $500 million from which it was stolen. And while zooming in, you can see also some green bubbles, and in this case, these green bubbles are the addresses of known exchanges. They were seen previously. I especially do not show on the proposal, do not show the names of these exchanges right now, but I can say that these are the major exchanges in this space which actually receive funds coming from this hack. And as you can see, we were able to track the exact destination in just below 2 minutes, which is, I think, unachievable for the traditional system. Yeah. Yeah,
We've got a few extra minutes.
Yeah, I think we've got to run out of time. I think it's going through.
Oh, it's going through again. I'll get through it here. There we go. And so we'll open it up for any discussion or questions, if you have any.
Yeah, I've got a question. So offshore financial centers are almost to a jurisdiction trying to sort of go into the blockchain business, pass legislation, attract participants. What are your thoughts on that? Is it a recipe for disaster, or do you see any value in what they're attempting?
Yeah, so
we'll bet that around.
Yeah, it very much depends on which jurisdictions are you talking about. So, for example, Gibraltar recently has implemented really quite substantial coverage. It requires the entities active in the crypto space to obtain the license, to renew this license each year. It requires them also to prove they have sufficient both KYC and anti-money and transaction monitoring coverage. In terms of other jurisdictions, it's not maybe yet that transparent, but yes, I can say that this is the early stage of this. And so some countries like US, Canada, or Japan, for example, they are already building similarly the good coverages for this market. Japan FSA, for example, also right now requires all the exchanges actually to be registered with them and comply with exactly the same AML standards. And most of these exchanges has very frequent controls from the FSA right now. Many of the exchanges which are actually small, means employing 20 to 50 people, they are not able actually to sustain with the KYC requirements with such resources, and most of them, it's likely that they will be forced to be closed by FSA.
And to echo a little bit differently, obviously if a license in Bermuda is going to carry different weight than a license from the United States. And so are you going to see these offshore havens appearing for crypto? I think the answer is going to be absolutely. It's going to depend on each jurisdiction and the players in that. But I don't know if the offshore is caught up, because right now there's the havens and you don't have to go offshore with crypto. And so you're seeing that as a developing region. As you get more compliance being put into place, I think you'll see more of a shift offshore.
Yeah, and just a comment, I think we've gave you lots of doom and gloom about cryptocurrency, but one of the things that is recognized is a huge percentage of the population in the world is unbanked. They don't have banks, they don't have ATMs, they don't have that type of technology, and this is something that gives them the opportunity to participate in the economic process, purchase, buy, grow businesses. And so, my opinion, and I think this is not going anywhere. It's going to be a component of our economy. I'm not saying what percentage of it's going to be, but again, what David said, it's going to depend on the country, and if the AML, BSA rules are in place, it's probably going to be okay, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah. Also, we can see that actually banks are trying to take their place in this market, and we see, for example, in Switzerland that many banks are actually requiring already that people who use crypto and they want to open the bank account, they require them to also provide the blockchain addresses, which are then the subject of evaluation. And we have had quite a few clients like that, for which actually we conducted in-depth source of funds evaluation in terms where actually from they have this crypto assets, if they were able to, for example, make such money on trading, whether these funds were somehow related to criminal activities. Possibly this is a good trend, and also giving some insights on how this system potentially may be regulated globally. Last month, we, for example, launched the pilot system where you can register your own blockchain addresses with your KYC profile, where you can also provide information about unusual addresses, and this is all being recorded in our database, and people who enter the service can actually check if the entity staying behind particular wallet is a verified entity, and it works. Actually, entities and people are starting to register on this and starting to provide the information about suspicious, unusual addresses, which also it's a kind of fascinating trend because it provides, I would say, some sort of democracy to the AML framework, which was not that much possible in a traditional financial sector.
And again, remember where crypto really gained its traction was in illicit purposes, right? And so now what you're seeing is sort of the mainstream world trying to make, legitimize where the original part of the industry was really bolting up against that. These are people that didn't want to be known. These are, users and buyers that wanted to stay anonymous. And so you're seeing sort of the flip of that as crypto develops, and that what modern day uses can be brought out of this, which is really where the compliance and all that comes into play more. But you have that competing market with the popular coins versus more the unpopular coins. So it's sort of fun to watch. It's fun to develop, but it is rampant for fraud as it's going through this process.
Yeah, the analogy that I've read time and time again, it's like the internet in the mid '90s. There was fear, internet. We're not going to be able to track it. Law enforcement, it's something that we can't get our arms around. And here we are years later. We still haven't got our arms around it, but we understand it a lot better than we did. And I think that's where the cryptocurrency is. It's almost going back 20, 30 years.
But in the 1990s, I mean, like the investments in sort of internet-based investment proved to be worthless, right? I mean, by and large. I'm struggling to understand what value, what intrinsic value, what underlying value any cryptocurrency has. And I was going to ask another question, and I don't know if this is obtuse or not, but how would one convert any cryptocurrency into, let's say, US dollars? Is there a way of doing that, or is it just not possible?
And that's where you see the exchanges. I'll start with the last one first. There's exchanges such as in the U.S. localbitcoins.com, which was a crypto to U.S. dollar to a fiat currency. Because again, cryptocurrency isn't necessarily backed by any sort of gold or silver. You've sort of gone back to the days of the value of salt. So salt, though, had its own intrinsic value, right? But you can go to a crypto exchange, just like when we got off the plane at the airport. There's currency exchanges. There are crypto exchanges that charge a fee for converting it. Those places have no necessarily BSA or AML compliance either. So that's where the compliance is sort of grading down onto those exchanges, and where you see the hacking of those exchanges, because that's where the money is.
But it has no value.
It is a.
Somebody just says, "Okay, I think it's worth something," but there's like literally.
It's a possessory interest. Yeah.
It just seems to be like pretty much worthless.
It's wizardry.
In reality.
Yeah, I mean, but again, like it's as you sort of grow up, at least in the States, Beanie Babies were a thing, Cabbage Patch Kids were a thing. Those were toys that had a possessory interest because there were a limited number. We're now into an algorithm having a value of what Bitcoin was at $14,000 or $19,000 per algorithm. It's got a trend to it that is captured and actually has that value. But again, if everybody in the crypto world decided, you're right, this was worth nothing, and we close shop tomorrow, then it's all worthless.
So if I set up an offshore shell company and did a pump and dump, I mean, that has some value for a limited period, and then it will inevitably go down to zero, right?
And that's where you see the cashing out having such issues, which is why you see these ATMs that are going up. They're going up in high drug, high crime areas where the drug dealers are saying, well, I'll just go cash out for my Bitcoin ATM when it gets converted to a currency I can take. So, I mean, yeah, and where you see sort of the next trend of sort of a legitimizing of it is with tokens. So if Amazon decides to create a token that you can only use on Amazon to pay, that's their currency, it's going to have an intrinsic sort of value. And that's where, if a coin or a token on an Amazon coin is, transferable to a different platform, there's a value there. There's, Fortnite, which is a very popular video game, it's got a token that has a value inside the game. And you're seeing that, which is really the next phase of where you're seeing tokens cross platforms and having value on multiple levels. That's really what I'm sort of looking at is the next sort of way.
And David, to answer your question, the analogy that I can bring up is again, going back probably 10 years ago. I had a drug investigation at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the agent walked in and explained this thing to me, and it blew my mind. It was Second Life. I don't know if it's maybe it still exists right now, but it's basically a virtual world. Okay, you get online and you can take, I could become David Marchant. I get online and can buy nice cars and live in a nice house and all this kind of stuff. And people value that. And so you're virtual, like they're throwing real money towards this virtual life and this virtual currency, and you can buy with real dollars. I want to have, $100 in virtual currency in this, this thing that's in the cloud. Well, they're using it to launder money. So they would trade, their virtual people would go online and trade, to launder money. And I think it's the same type of thing with, no value to me. I wouldn't go on Second Life and,
And where it's become an easy money laundering platform, I'll give you sort of another example is when the Poker Stars cases went down, which was big FBI, IRS, multi-jurisdictional cases. If everybody thought, yeah, it's poker, but you could literally sit warlords from different countries at the same poker table, feed currency across the table. You're going to lose this hand, and I'm going to lose this hand, and you literally have the capability of laundering funds at a poker table through just tokens. So is it scary in ways? Yes. Has that nefarious section caught up to that? I don't know if it's to the degree that you're seeing the value of the coins, but it's there and it's got that capacity.
So just to clarify, if I had 20 Bitcoin, how would I convert that to US dollars so I could generally use it?
You can go to a currency exchange. You can go to a Coinbase.
So they will, like legitimate exchanges will...
If I want to take my British pounds and convert them to dollars, you go to the same place. It's just a virtual currency exchange, and you're going to pay a fee for exchanging, your transaction. They'll run, a lot of times you'll see what's called a dust transaction, which were popular on the dark web, where you're going to test. They're going to test to make sure that your wallet, your e-wallet, has that much currency.
Are these, bona fide banks? Are they doing this?
Well, Bitcoin has a Visa card now, I believe.
Yeah.
I think they've got a Visa, so you get a Bitcoin account, you can go shopping.
I could go to a sort of a well-known bank and just say I want to exchange instead of euros for dollars, Bitcoin for dollars.
I'm not sure if we're there.
I don't know if we're there yet.
Not yet. There are not yet banks which actually do that. There are some banks which are actually starting accept deposits in crypto. So probably we can also expect this type of service maybe next year.
So how do I get my dollars then? I'm struggling to see.
You have a virtual wallet, okay, an e-wallet, and in that you have a virtual account. And with an account number like what we just ran through,
right.
And then you can transfer a percentage of your coins into the exchange, and they will feed you back whatever type of currency that it's valued at, given the type of coin and whatever their currency transaction fee is.
So how do I physically? So those dollars.
They'll wire those.
It can actually go into a bank, and then
You want to get the technical?
Yeah. So.
Or can I only use it in that sort of universe?
Basically, you can exchange Bitcoin to dollars and other way around in the same way like you do with the assets on the exchange, traditional exchange market. So you have the platform when you can convert one asset into another. And in this case, in case of Bitcoins, let's say you've got some dollars, you just transfer this to the bank account of the exchange on which you would like to exchange this to Bitcoins. You make
the
it...
other way around. I understand that, I can give somebody dollars and it can be converted to Bitcoin, but, the other way around, though,
You can cash them out.
Into
in
real
the same
money,
way
into real money that I can just spend anywhere I want?
Yep. Yeah, that's how it's being laundered and converted into a fiat or a regular type of currency, is that same exchange will flip. If I want to buy a Bitcoin from you, Dave, I can buy one from you on the exchange, and if you want to cash, you're going to get cash for it. It cashes out. And that's where all the regulations and the money, because that is essentially forming a bank, right, in its simplest form. And so that's where the AML and the BSA of the money service business under U.S. regulations comes in, because you've got to know that I'm not selling, machine guns to the Venezuelan army. And, for virtual currencies, that's the challenge, is that I'm trying to do that without you finding out that I'm really selling those M16s.
Yeah, or you can simply buy a property with Bitcoin. There was a nice property at Berkeley Square recently for sale only for Bitcoin.
Yeah.
How much is that property worth, just out of curiosity? Or how much was it on the market for? And was it a marketing gimmick, or was it genuine?
Well, I don't remember the figures exactly. Berkeley Square is an attractive place, so I guess a few millions.
I don't know if you're getting a deal by buying it.
Was it sold?
Yeah, I heard it was sold, actually. Yeah.
In Bitcoin or
in Bitcoin,
regular money?
Yeah.
Yeah, and going back to, I think it was our second or third slide, we've got Microsoft, Tesla, Expedia, Subway, Overstock.com. They're all accepting Bitcoin.
Think of Apple Pay with the Bitcoin. That's it. You just show up, scan your virtual wallet, and it debits your e-wallet X number of dollars for the transaction, so to speak.
Okay, we'll go to lunch now. It's on the first floor. And I don't think you can pay in Bitcoin anything in this hotel.
Thank you.
Thanks.